I wanted to come to the floor today to talk a little bit about the state of public education in this country, especially when it comes to the condition of poor children in the United States, in part because I think it is urgent that we fix No Child Left Behind, a law that is not working well for kids and for teachers, for moms and dads all across the United States, and certainly in my home state of Colorado. Sometimes people that aren't engaged in the work of teaching our kids, which is, I think, the hardest work that anybody can do short of going to war, don't realize just how horrific the outcomes are for children in this great country of ours, especially children living in poverty. And sometimes when I'm on this floor where there are 100 desks, there are 100 senators, I think a little bit about what the condition would be of the people here if they were not senators. But if these 100 people were poor children living in the United States of America in the 21st century. First of all, Mr. President, it's important to recognize that of the 100 senators, of the 100 kids in this great country, 42 of the 100 would be living in poverty. 42 out of 100 would be poor. Of those senators, now poor children living in this country, by the age of 4, as this chart shows, they would have heard only 1/3 of the words heard by their more affluent peers. They're living in poverty. They've heard 13 million words. A child in a professional family has heard 45 million words. There isn't a kindergarten teacher in this country that wouldn't tell you that that makes an enormous difference right out of the chutes. By age 4, only 39 of the 100 children can recognize the letters of the alphabet. Just 39 of 100 by age 4. In contrast, 85% of the children coming from middle-class families can recognize the letters of the alphabet. Again, there's not a kindergarten teacher, there's not a high school teacher that wouldn't tell you that that makes an enormous difference to kids when they come to school in terms of their readiness to learn. But what happens, Mr. President, when they go to school, when they're actually in our school? By the 4th grade, only 17 out of 100 children in poverty can read at grade level. 17. That's fewer kids than there are desks in this section of the Senate floor. The entire rest of the floor would be kids that cannot read at grade level by the 4th grade. These kids are reading at grade level. Everyone else all across this beautiful chamber would not be able to read at grade level. In America, in the 21st century, only this section can read proficiently, 4th grade. What happens as they stay in school? Mr. President, it gets worse. By the 8th grade, only 16 of our kids can read at grade level. Could wander around the entire rest of this chamber looking for somebody who can read proficiently, and I wouldn't be able to find them. I've been in classrooms, as you know, Mr. President, all across my state, all across the great city of Denver, and all across this country, and in my view, there is nothing more at war with who we are as Americans or who we are as Coloradans than a 5th grade child reading at the 1st grade level. There's a lot of discussion on this floor about your moral right to this and your moral right to that. I can't think of anything less American than a child in the 5th grade doing 1st grade math. Speaking of math, in a world where technology and engineering and invention is going to dominate the 21st century economy, how are we doing in math? 17 of our kids at the 8th grade are proficient mathematicians. You know, when I took the job as superintendent of schools in Denver, a district of 75,000 children, one of the greatest cities in the greatest country in the world, On the 10th grade math test that the state administers, Mr. President, in that district of 75,000 children, there were 33 African-American students proficient on that test and 61 Latino students proficient on the test. Fewer than 4 classrooms worth of kids proficient on a test that measures, if we're honest with ourselves, which we're not, a junior high school standard of mathematical proficiency in Europe. That's what we're doing to our kids. By the end of high school, if this Senate were a classroom of poor children in this country, only 57 of us would be around to graduate. And only 25 are actually ready for college or ready for a career. That's a quarter of this room. 75, you can just write them off. 75 of these tests. And it gets even worse after that, because of our 100 children, only 9 will graduate from college. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. These 2 rows of desks, Mr. President, represent children coming from zip codes where they're living in poverty and who ultimately make it through and graduate from college. That's it. 2 rows in one section of the United States Senate. No one in these rows will graduate from college, and no one in any of these desks from here to the other side of this floor will graduate from college. That's been true for a generation, Mr. President. And if we don't do things differently, it's going to be true for this generation of kindergartners if we don't change what we do. Sometimes people think this is someone else's problem. It's not a question of national interest. I can't imagine why anybody would think that, but some people do. McKinsey, the consulting group, has done a study that shows that the effect of this dropout rate that we have creates a permanent recession in our economy, as great as the one that we've been through. In other words, if we were graduating these kids from college, our economic growth would be far greater than it is right now. And you can see the effect in this recession that we just came out of. On people with less than a high school diploma, the unemployment rate was 15.3%. You can see the numbers here, but if you had a bachelor's degree or higher, your unemployment rate was 4%. 15% versus 4% in this recession that we just went through. But the point is also that it creates a chronic recession, a drag on our economy. Not to mention the fact that if you go to the prisons in this country and you ask people, did you graduate from high school? The answer is that somewhere in the neighborhood of 85% of the people in our prisons are high school dropouts. It doesn't take a lot of imagination to figure out how you might start solving that problem by actually graduating kids from high school and getting them ready for college. Again, this isn't about we're kind of sort of doing okay. 9 kids from poverty, on average, making it through to a college degree. 91 not. And it's not as though those odds are somehow fairly distributed across the population in the United States of America. Huge international implications, Mr. President, of all of this as well. And you can see these are our students compared to their international peers on the 8th grade math test, and you can see that our Anglo kids are scoring up here. Korea, Singapore, Japan, Anglo kids in the United States of America. The U.S. average is here, so you got to go Hungary, England, Russian Federation, U.S. average. I don't know why we wouldn't want to be first, but we're not first. But look at how our Latino kids are doing and our African American kids are doing. Armenia, Australia, Sweden, Malta, Scotland, Serbia, Italy, our Latino kids. Way down here. But let's keep going. Malaysia, Norway, Cyprus, Bulgaria, Israel, Ukraine, Romania, our U.S. African American students, right above Bosnia, 2 spots above Lebanon. Think about it through the eyes of one of our African-American students living in a neighborhood in poverty, in Chicago or Denver or Los Angeles or Boston. What are the odds that you think you're actually going to be able to graduate, that you're going to be able to contribute to the democracy, contribute meaningfully to our economy, compete in this global economy? They're not long. They're not long, and they know they're not long. Mr. President, I'll close just by saying that we can't fix this problem from Washington. We can't. But we can call attention to the question. We can create policies and suggestions about how people ought to do the work differently. Having served as a superintendent in an urban school district for almost 4 years and spent time with our kids, spent time with our teachers, I know we can succeed. The kids have the intellectual capacity to do the work. There's no doubt that they do. But they are in a system that was designed deep in the last century. In fact, if we're honest about it, a lot of the way the system was designed was in colonial America. And in my judgment, it's time for the burden to shift from the people that want to change the system to the people that want to keep it the same. There were nights sometimes in the school board meetings when people would come and they'd say, Michael, how do you sleep at night doing this and doing that and trying to change this and worrying about that? And I would say to them, the reason I can sleep at night is that I don't think we could do any worse than we're doing. So we ought to think about stopping doing what we're doing and figure out how to change the way we think about recruiting, retaining, and inspiring teachers in the 21st century. We ought to elevate standards so that we're not kidding ourselves across the country about whether we're competing with our international rivals, and we stop cheating our kids by telling them they're succeeding when they're not compared to kids across the globe. We got to get out of the business of measuring things that don't make any sense to anybody right now that's working in our schools. Who cares how this year's fourth graders did compared to last year's fourth graders? What we need to know is, how did this group of fifth graders do compared to how they did as fourth graders, compared to how they did as third graders? That's just common sense, but that's not the way the law works today. I see my colleague is here from Georgia, so I'll close, but I want to say this first. We cannot keep No Child Left Behind the way that it is. It is contributing to the problem that's out there. It is making the work harder to do, not easier to do, for our teachers, for our principals, and for our kids. Our moms and dads are right to point out that it's measuring the wrong thing and thinking about data in the wrong way. And we ought to take this opportunity in a bipartisan way to fix No Child Left Behind, to lift some of that burden from our kids and from our teachers and our principals. And what we have to do as we're doing that is we've got to point to the places where it's actually working, to demonstrate that the fact that you're born into a zip code defined by poverty doesn't mean your life is going to be defined by poverty. We need to point to examples of people that have managed to struggle through, or schools that have managed to struggle through and beat the odds and send 95 and 98% of their poor children on to get a college degree. And we need to be asking ourselves why we're not achieving that at scale. I am the proud father of 3 little girls, and I can tell you that if anyone in this body faced the same odds for their children or for their grandchildren that poor children in America face, there is no way that we wouldn't be talking about this issue night and day. In fact, people might give up, I might give up, and rush home and say, I'm going to take my kids out of that place they're in, and I'm going to put them in a place with the finest teachers, and I'm going to give up this Senate floor to make sure as a parent that I'm involved in their education. There is no way we would accept these odds for our own children. And what I would argue is that the children that I'm talking about are our children. Remember, 42 out of 100 are living in poverty in this country. What's our answer for them, Mr. President? So I look forward to working with my colleagues on both sides of this aisle to not make excuses, to not find a reason why we can't lead, to not find a reason why we can't fix No Child Left Behind, but instead to create some hope for children all across our country living in urban and rural areas that are suffering this horrible plight. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor.